Que ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
Свет в кромешной темноте, и Богу была названа цена. Прогнулись все и братья во Христе, прогнулось все, но не моя страна. Был урожайным высокосный год, и кровью смерть была пьяным пьяна, а тучь свинцовых гнулся небосвод. Прогнулось все, но не моя страна. Полнеба пламя, полнеба смог, Донбассом нами и с нами Бог. Полнеба пламя, полнеба смог, Россия с нами и с нами Бог. Из памяти не предали отцов, здесь не отдали дедовской земли. Какой ценою не отыщешь слов, здесь за отчизну жизни берегли. И снова сила русская в руках, и жизнь и смерть за родину красна. Стоит и держит небосвод века, моя непокоренная страна. Полнеба пламя, полнеба смог, Донбассом нами и с нами Бог. Полнеба пламя, полнеба смог, Россия с нами и с нами Бог.
Donbass is behind us. Russia is behind us. Long live the fascist resistance in eastern Ukraine, in Russia, in Donetsk and Luhansk. What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 57, Unmasking Imperialism. exposing imperialist propaganda in mainstream media. Today, we are exposing imperialist NATO propaganda about Russian aggression, so-called Russian aggression. In reality, it is the West, the Western imperialist powers, US, Canada, NATO, that are trying to provoke a new world war. And shout out to my comrade, Flame of Liberation, for providing us with the translations for that intro music from some really amazing revolutionary artists from Eastern Ukraine, talking about the resistance in Donbass. We're going to get into that. We're going to talk about why it's important for communists to defend Russia against imperialism, for the Russian people to get the support and love they deserve from people in the West against war. And today we're uniting around some very simple demands that everybody should be raising. Hands off Russia, stop fucking with Russia, leave Russia alone. No to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a fascist imperialist organization that has bombed and destroyed and looted countries around the world. No to NATO, dismantle that shit. No to Ukrainian fascism, which we're going to get into today. A lot of people tend to view Ukraine, especially the Euromaidan, quote unquote, revolution, as some liberal hipster uprising. It was a fascist coup, a fascist revolt. No to Ukrainian fascism. Solidarity with Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, which are regions of quote unquote Eastern Ukraine with large Russian majority populations and also non-Russians as well, who are anti-fascist, anti-Ukrainian fascist, and anti-NATO, and want peace, want sovereignty, want stability. They don't want any more war. And as the women in the intro music were mentioning, they want peace, they want stability, they don't want violence and any more invasions. And last but not least, especially relevant for those of us in the imperial core countries in the US and Canada and Europe, money for jobs and education, not wars and occupation. We have plenty of problems here to solve, plenty of homelessness, plenty of unemployment. We don't need more money for wars, for occupations on the other side of the world that kill both people here and over there. So those are some of the demands that we're uniting around, and we're focusing on Russia, hands off Russia. And I'm glad to introduce two of my good comrades. First, let's start off with Flame of Liberation. Flame of Liberation is an anti-imperialist activist based in New York City. Has a great channel. Subscribe to Flame of Liberation. The link is in the description. And also, Flame of Liberation was the one who translated that intro video. Has really great content on Bothism, on the anti-fascist resistance in Ukraine and Russia. A good comrade that I've known for many years, based in New York, my home city. Shout out to New York. How's it going, comrade Flame of Liberation?
Very good. And it's great to be here to discuss this issue with you. You know, we're bombarded day in, day out with the imperialist propaganda. And it's really important that those of us who are anti-imperialist, those of us who are opposed to fascism, those of us who understand history, give an actual truthful analysis of what's going on. Because, you know, even though they have like nonstop coverage of this, quote unquote coverage of this in the mainstream media, and it's day in, day out. With all the time they spend on it, they never have enough time supposedly to give the other side. They give so much coverage, but it's only from one side. It's completely one-sided. It shows how insanely biased the media is. You know, the way they could try and portray Russia as the supposed aggressor when it's dealing with a situation on its own border, while contrary, the United States has troops and forces in Ukraine on the opposite side of the world. How can anyone try and say that it's Russia and not the US that is the aggressor?
Most definitely. Really great point, Comrade Flame of Liberation. It reminds me also as well, I'm speaking to y'all from Southern California, and not too far from me is San Diego, where they have huge U.S. military bases. It would be like mainstream media saying the U.S. is like Mexican media saying U.S. is deploying troops along the Mexican border. And it's just the nonsense of it. And also joining us as well is my comrade, my brother, BLevel from Ewoks Unhinged. Ewoks Unhinged is a 21st century socialist channel. He has amazing content, amazing discussions. What I like about Ewoks Unhinged is that it's very chill. It feels like you're just hanging out with friends and talking about politics, sometimes going into some funny, silly stuff, which I enjoy and is very entertaining, but also bringing that fire, that educational material. So please subscribe to Ewoks Unhinged. Links is in the description. How's it going, Comrade BLevel?
Thanks very much, Ramiro, for the kind words. Always a good time streaming with both of you. Unfortunately, today we're coming under quite heavy circumstances with the drumming up of war against Russia. And so for those that don't know, like Ramiro said, I cover a host of topics. I'm up north in Canada. I'm an anti-imperialist and an internationalist. So I'll be approaching that from this perspective. And I'll be talking about a lot of things that have been the Looney Tunes logic coming out of Canada, in addition to the United States, against Russia. But without further ado, I'll let you guys take away the rest of the discussion.
Most definitely. Thank you so much. And shout out to everybody who's watching and listening. Alex Giovanni, long live the Donetsk People's Republic. Long live the Luhansk People's Republic. NATO hands off Russia. Most definitely, Alex. And I'm glad you mentioned that because not a lot of people really know about those two republics. We're going to get into that later on. EH said, this is just what a bunch of Snowden East Coast fuckers needed. Yeah, no, most definitely. Out here in Cali, it's still pretty warm, thankfully, but solidarity with y'all on the East Coast where it's cold. Mario said
last week it was pretty snowy, so I could connect there with what he's saying. These streams really keep the morale in these times.
Most definitely. Shout out to Comrade Erica, to Non-Standard Proletarian, to ML 186, to Comrade Jenny Lynn, everybody for watching and listening. If you have any comments or questions for either Flame of Liberation or BLevel, just put it in the chat and we'll get to it later on. What I want to do is I want to play a clip. This is from everybody's favorite news source, MSNBC, which is one of the media outlets that has been drumming up war, the drums of war against Russia for so long, right? Funded by the Rockefellers, funded by the oil giants that are salivating over the idea of privatizing Russia's natural gas industry. This is them talking about Biden pledging economic support to Ukraine as Russia conducts more exercises near the border. This is just from yesterday, so they have some of the latest news. So we're going to play this and just give an overview of what's been happening.
Conduct more live fire exercises near Ukraine's border and continue to build up tanks, fighter jets, warships, and missile launchers around the country's borders. President Biden once again called Ukraine's President Zelensky, promising economic support. President Biden and NATO members have repeatedly said no troops will be coming to Ukraine's assistance. But it's increasingly clear the Biden administration and President Zelensky don't agree on the risk of a Russian invasion.
We've always said, and said for quite some time, that another incursion by Russia could be imminent, and imminent means imminent.
President Biden, along with most European leaders, has warned with so much force assembled, a Russian invasion should be expected.
My guess is he will move in.
With the chances of a Russian attack increasing, a Western intelligence official tells us, as Vladimir Putin mobilizes more troops over the next 2 to 3 weeks for exercises in Belarus. President Zelensky has told his people there's no unusual risk and blamed the United States for stirring panic. It's left many Ukrainians not knowing what to do. There are no public orders for drilling, no mass call-ups of reserves, no tests of emergency response systems, just life as normal. It seems there will be no military invasion, says Marina. I believe this. I want to believe this. Some Ukrainians accuse President Zelensky of publicly urging calm to bolster his own support, as he's challenged politically by Ukraine's former president and ex-champion boxer, now Kiev mayor, Vitaly Klitschko. It's not an option to relax and stay calm. Things could explode at any minute, says Alexander Vizirov, an Army veteran. But ignore it or not, the threat, U.S. and NATO officials say, is real and mounting. The door to diplomacy is still not closed. Today, the French president spoke with Russia's Vladimir Putin, and Russia's foreign minister says it is still studying a written response that the United States and NATO gave to Russia. So the possibility of talks is still there, Savannah.
All right, Richard Engel in Ukraine for us. Thank you, Richard.
So a lot of nonsense, a lot of propaganda. What I find interesting are some of the divisions within the European Union. Seems like Germany is kind of taking a different route. France, it seems to be determined. Some countries, of course, are allied 100% with the U.S. and starting this aggression. But I wanted to start off with you, Comrade Flame of Liberation. First of all, break down for us what's wrong with this whole liberal narrative around Russia and Ukraine. Like, for me, what incentive would Russia have to invade Ukraine out of nowhere? And second of all, is it an invasion when we're talking about certain parts of eastern Ukraine that are predominantly Russian? And what I would like to know as well is your thoughts on, like, what is the timing of this and what is the goal of the Western imperialists in doing this now?
Yeah, that whole clip, it's the standard thing we've been seeing. And it's so false. It's so wrong, and it lacks any sort of historical context whatsoever and all of this. And it is interesting, though, that they mention that there's this division between the Ukrainian government, the Kiev regime, and the U.S. government, because the Ukrainian government really is a puppet government of the U.S. We have to remember that this government was established with the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Ukraine in 2013, 2014. And since then, up until the pro-NATO, basically puppets of the U.S. have been in control of Kyiv. So despite the fact that they are, it's a puppet regime of the U.S., even for them, they're starting to get a little upset at the U.S. because the U.S. is really using them as cannon fodder to try and provoke a war with Russia. And so that's interesting that they talk about that a little bit. But you notice they never give any sort of explanation or reasoning from the side of Russia. They just make it seem as though this is happening for no reason whatsoever. It's just quote unquote Russian expansionism. They never give any of the perspective from Russia. And even if you disagree with it from their perspective, the mainstream media, even if you disagree with it, what Russia is saying, you should at least show it. And the fact that they don't even show it shows the weakness of the NATO American position. It shows that they're so wrong and their argument is so weak that they can't even show a counter narrative, because it would be so obvious to the viewers who's right, and the United States and NATO are not right. Furthermore, they don't talk about how there's already a war going on in Ukraine. Since 2014, the people in the east of Donbass have declared independence from this fascist coup regime that took power in 2014, illegally overthrowing the democratically elected of Ukraine, the democratically elected government of Ukraine in 2014. And the Kiev regime has been bombing the civilians of Donbass, of eastern Ukraine, with full American support, full NATO support, and it's been killing so many people. Just horrible crimes going on there, and they never talk about that. You know, they always talk about this supposed Russian invasion. There was no Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's a complete lie. What's been going on is the Kyiv regime has been killing its own people in the east of the country who wanted nothing to do with this neo-fascist coup regime that came about. Another very important thing that they don't mention is they talk about this Russian buildup of forces within their own country, mind you. Russia is building up forces within its own country. There are American troops inside of Ukraine. their British troops inside of Ukraine. So who has invaded Ukraine? Russia hasn't, but the United States, Britain, NATO have forces in Ukraine, already occupying Ukraine. So they leave all of this out because they have to make Russia out to be a villain, even though it's clearly one-sided. Aggression from NATO, trying to ramp up hostilities with Russia, potentially provoking a war using the Ukrainians as cannon fodder for the interests of NATO expansionism.
Most definitely. And I think you hit on something that's really important, which is the role of propaganda in demonizing Russians. I think one thing that's fascinating is the word magic behind how they craft these headlines, like mobilizing troops along the Ukrainian border. Well, Russia borders Ukraine, so that's within its own country, right? So but when you hear that, mobilizing troops along Ukrainian border, it's like, okay, it seems like they're going to go and attack and invade Ukraine, but it's within the own country. And the other thing as well about the propaganda is the portrayal of Russians in movie. I remember growing up, like every bad guy in the movie was like a Russian guy smoking cigarettes with like a leather jacket and being like, I'm going to destroy you. And it's just like the portrayal of Russians is so crazy. But I wanted to, shifting over to you, Comrade BLevel, maybe you can talk a little bit about, you're in Canada, you're in the Great North. Tell us about the role of Canada in NATO imperialism, because a lot of times Canada gets a pass, right? We know about, U.S. aggression. It's not just the U.S. as well, but it's also Canada. Canada's playing a role in this. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that and the whole debacle with Justin Trudeau?
Yeah, Ukraine is quite a hot topic here. You wouldn't think Canada and Ukraine have very much connection just geographically. But around in the 1930s, basically Ukrainian aristocrats were leaving the Soviet Union. I believe with the help of the British Empire, they settled in Canada. And so since then, there's been a huge Ukrainian far-right lobby in Canadian politics to support like Ukraine right-wing nationalism. And something that's very interesting to note is, I believe it was in 2018, a professor at the University of Alberta, he was teaching about Soviet farming collectivization. And as we know, there's a lot of neo-Nazi myths about collectivization and saying Stalin wanted to genocide Ukrainians, and it was nothing of the sort. Anybody that studies it knows that for centuries, that region geographically was having famines. The collectivization, if you follow what happened post their initial attempt, is they put an end to famines. With the exception of maybe, I think, after World War II. But I mean, come on, it's World War II. Like, a lot of things were destroyed. But other than that, if you look throughout the history of the Soviet Union, there were no more famines for the rest of its existence. But there's this whole myth about the collective farming. So this professor, he was trying to basically say exactly what I'm saying right now. And the Ukrainian far-right nationalist lobby, they actually got him canceled. They got the premier, our equivalent of a governor, to Jason Kenney, by the way, who has done an absolute debauchery of the COVID-19 handling. Anybody can look that up. Jason Kenney went in on this professor, and it just shows the power of the Ukrainian far-right nationalist lobby in Canada and this propaganda. And interesting to note is our deputy prime minister, Chrystia Freeland, also the minister of finance. She is the granddaughter of a prominent, I forget his name exactly. He was a Nazi operative in World War II who was in charge of the leading anti-Semitic propaganda newspaper in Ukraine. And his granddaughter is telling all the Canadians, we got to go to war with Russia. And I was listening to her and Justin speak, that being Justin Trudeau. We call him Justin in Canada, not to be confused with Justin Bieber or whatever. But yeah, I was listening to her and Justin speak about this, and I could hear the ire in her voice towards Russians. And it comes from those Ukrainian aristocrats and those Nazi compradors who just hate the Soviet Union. Because as I spoke to before with collectivization, the Soviet Union benefited Ukrainian people like all other peoples within the Soviet Union. But what the far-right Ukrainian nationalists push here is all the wacko myths you've ever heard of the Soviet Union and more. And something very interesting to note, Nick and I, we actually did a conversation with Professor Danny Shah on a similar topic that will be out later today. And they were mentioning, I believe it was Danny Shah who was talking about this, how the Soviet Union's over. Socialism is over in that region. So why is it that the Western imperialists continually want to go to war with Russia? Because like, what excuse it? Russia's a capitalist country. Sure, Putin's a Bonapartist, but it is a capitalist country. So why? It's all about dismantling other poles. It's about Western Anglo-American imperialist hegemony over the world. They don't want any other poles to emerge, be that Russian, be that Chinese, be that Bolivarian, be that African. You can look throughout this end of history period from 1991 to the present, the last 30 years, anytime there's been a socialist or progressive nationalist force that has been building up economic development in their region, bam, the imperialists come in and smash the whole thing. And that's what they're attempting to do here. But Russia is stronger. China is definitely stronger. And you're seeing the pushback here. And to bring back to Canadian imperialism, what Canadian imperialism is, our role, not our, but like, our state's role in Western imperialism is Canada is cry-bully imperialism. When they see China standing strong, when they see Russia standing strong, they act like they've been hit when they were the ones who threw the punch. And I just see this repeatedly. For example, when Meng Wanzhou, I believe CFO from Huawei, when she was captured by Canada at the behest of the United States, China said, oh, okay, this is how it's going to be. So they took two Canadians who were prominent people in business, mind you. They weren't random Canadians. They were like high up, rich businessmen. They held them and said, okay, we'll do a hostage exchange. And for 2 years, Canada didn't do anything. Then they finally gave up and did the exchange. And I was saying from the start, I'm like, look, just give free Meng and those Canadian men, the two Michaels, they'll be free. And sure enough, when Canada did end up freeing Meng, the two Canadians were freed by China. But China was vilified for 2 years for this. And it's like China is just doing tit for tat. They're playing the game. They're like, okay, you're going to take one of our people hostage. We're not going to take that line down. We're not going to be pushed around. So Canada does cry-bully imperialism by blaming the other people in the world for standing up for themselves when that's the natural response to defend yourself, to defend your people. Anyway, that's my whole spiel on Canada. And I could say more about that clip. I've been talking for a bit, so I want to let you guys continue.
Most definitely. Yeah, I think that's a really important point to hit on, the role of Canada as well in global imperialism, especially in terms of mining and banking. But that's as well, we can get into that in another topic. But one thing that I think is important to mention is the progressive revolutionary role of Russia and the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, throughout history, because people act like Russia has been this horrible, evil empire, that it's terrorized and pillaged people around the world. But in fact, Russia has a lot of support and solidarity from people all over the world, not just during the Soviet era, but also in the modern day. So I want to share, these are two pictures that Comrade Flame of Liberation sent me. This first one is Soviet Navy in Syria. This is a Soviet officer in Syria during, obviously, the 20th century. And you have Syrian children gathering around and warmly greeting them. Soviet Union played a very progressive anti-imperialist role throughout this time in many countries in the region. And another picture that I want to show, this is from maybe Comrade Flame of Liberation can talk about this. I believe a communist in the Middle East who fighting on the front lines against terrorism, against Daesh, against imperialist-backed forces. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Comrade Flame of Liberation, the role of Russia and the Soviet Union progressive around the world, just to kind of contrast some of the lies, right? We can talk about Syria, we can talk about Eastern Europe, anything that you would like to mention.
Yeah, as far as those pictures, the first one, I think that was in the 70s or 80s with the Soviet Navy in Syria. The Soviet Union had troops and Navy in Syria, even manning anti-aircraft positions around the border with the Zionist regime of Israel, helping to defend Syria's sovereignty from Zionist aggression. And the second picture is actually Syrian Arab Army soldiers holding the flag, which it's in Arabic there, but that's I believe the translation is basically of like this, what they use in Russia, it's the victory banner. representing the victory in World War II, and they're celebrating there with the hammer and sickle, the Soviet victory banner, the anniversary of May 9th, the Victory Day over Nazi Germany and fascism in Europe at the time on May 9th. And so, yeah, this Soviet Union was the leading force for anti-imperialism around the world. The Russian Revolution of 1917 opened the new page in humanity, where there was the possibility for the oppressed people, the exploited people, to rule their own societies and govern themselves. And this had a undescribably massive impact on the world. That's why we saw, following the Russian Revolution and the establishment of the Soviet Union, the shaking of colonialism around the world and the eventual rise of the national liberation movements throughout the Third World. And the Soviet Union was there everywhere, supporting the national liberation forces, as you saw in that picture in Syria, big time in the Arab world, in Syria and Iraq, supporting both Ba'athist countries. Egypt with Gamal Abdel Nasser, helping to really develop Egypt's economy and industry. Libya as well, Algeria, Yemen, and then throughout all of Africa, supporting the anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist forces, helping to fight against apartheid and white supremacy in Africa, helping to fight against the white supremacist settler regime of Rhodesia and apartheid in South Africa, and throughout all over, fighting against Portuguese colonialism and other colonialists in Angola, all over Africa, supporting national liberation. In East Asia, of course, China, Korea, Vietnam, and throughout Latin America, Nicaragua, Cuba, everywhere where people were fighting. And of course, going back to the Arab world, Palestine, the Soviet Union, in Saddam Hussein's words, who was one of the big pan-Arabist Arab nationalists, he said that the Soviet Union was the key champion of the Arab cause throughout the world, and the key champion of the struggle for Palestine. Soviet soldiers not only manned the anti-aircraft positions in Syria on the border with the occupation regime of Israel, they even had special forces that went head-to-head with the Israelis in some of the battles and conflicts that took part with the Soviets on the side of the Arab armies. So the Soviets have been massively supporting anti-imperialism throughout the world, also supporting the struggle for Black liberation in the United States, supporting the civil rights movement. When Emmett Till was brutally murdered by racists, the Soviet Union helped to spread awareness about that and really shame the United States. And we have to remember that in the context of the Cold War, the United States having this openly racist system of segregation made them look very bad. So the fact that they had pressure from the Soviet Union, China, the various anti-imperialist forces around the world sort of forced their hand to do some of the legislation that they eventually did. And going back even a bit further than that, even prior to that, obviously this isn't on the same level, but even during the time of some of the czars, not the last czar, but some of the earlier ones, you know, this is something that Americans don't know, but really should know, which is that during the time of the American Civil War, Russia supported the North. Russia sent its navy to block the British, who were supporting the Confederacy. And that was very important for the North because the British imperialists were supporting the Confederacy, the system of slavery in the South. And Russia played an important role in weakening the British ability to support the Southern Confederacy. So jumping ahead, 1991, there is no longer the Soviet Union. Russia at that time, under Boris Yeltsin, had basically a pro-Western puppet as a president who allowed the looting of the country. The most disastrous period, arguably, in human history outside of warfare. You had the decline in the life expectancy of average Russian male by, I believe it was 5 years, which is unprecedented outside of warfare or disease that would take place. That's capitalism and the destruction of socialism that did that. And the complete destruction, privatization of the 1990s that took place in Russia, which destroyed the economy, destroyed the lives of the people, which eventually gave rise to a counter to that, which was Vladimir Putin, who came in and he stabilized the situation. Of course, he's not a socialist or communist, but he undid a lot of the neoliberal, ultra neoliberal policies that had looted the country, and he brought back somewhat of a state sector to stabilize the economy very effectively. And since then, the United States has been very unhappy with that. The fact that Russia was starting to stand again and to develop and improve itself again. And so the United States was starting to, dislike that. And even before that, the United States was doing certain things to Russia, even during Yeltsin, despite him being a puppet. But Putin despite doing that, he didn't do that in the context of sort of like an anti-West or anti-US position. He wanted to remain friends with the US, and in the early 2000s, he let so much slide in relations with the US. You have to remember the US invasion of Iraq. Iraq was a long-standing ally of the Soviet Union, and that was inherited into the Russian Federation. There were close relations between Russia and Iraq still. And Russia did not take a hostile, position to the United States, despite the United States going in and destroying the country, and a country that was its ally. And a lot of Russians, more communist and nationalist Russians, wanted to do something to stop the U.S. from invading Iraq. But nonetheless, Putin was very conciliatory in that, and other things. But then there was Libya as well, and the situation in Syria. And things came to a head, and it became more and more obvious that the United States was not interested in a partner, which the Russian Federation, I think, truly believed that the United States would treat them with respect. Now that the Cold War is over, Russia's no longer socialist. What's the reason for having this crazy hatred of Russia anymore? But it turned out that the United States still had designs on Russia and viewed Russia very negatively, despite Russia trying its very best to have good relations with the U.S. It's forgotten, George Bush, in 2001, he pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty unilaterally. Russia wanted to continue that. That was a treaty between the U.S. and the USSR, and Bush pulled out of it. What's the reasoning for that? The Cold War is over. The countries are supposedly supposed to be friends. Why is the U.S. pulling out of these treaties? That looks very aggressive on the part of the U.S., but still Russia did not take a hostile stance to the U.S., was a little concerned about that, but at that point, they didn't do any sort of counter to that. And then, NATO kept expanding towards Russia's borders. Now, as far as NATO, it's very important to go into the history of NATO, because this is never talked about, but it's so basic. Anyone can just find this. This is totally not disputable at all. The excuse for NATO was that it was used to prevent supposed Soviet aggression, which the facts don't back that up, that the Soviets were aggressive. But let's just take that argument that they say it was supposedly to stop Soviet aggression. Well, if that were the case, how come NATO was founded before the Warsaw Pact was founded? The Warsaw Pact was founded after NATO was founded, and it was founded as a reaction to NATO's aggressive stance towards the Soviet Union. And furthermore, if it was supposedly to stop this supposed Soviet aggression, how come the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union has been gone for 30 years. The Soviet Union, Russia, pulled its forces out of Central Europe, Eastern Europe, back to Russia. The Warsaw Pact disbanded. Why did it not end? Well, that's because it was never defensive. It was never just about the Soviet Union. It was about American hegemony. It was about the rule of the Western corporations, banks, and so on through this military organization to dominate the world, to dominate Europe, and to dominate the world, indeed. As we saw, NATO's mission of expansionism and destruction is not set to Europe alone. In 2011, they bombed and destroyed Libya, which was the most prosperous country in Africa. Until this day, Libya is in tatters. There is, open slave markets, all kinds of terrorist groups operating in Libya because of the NATO overthrow of the Libyan government at the time. So Russia's looking at this, NATO expansion, NATO's aggressive activities, destroying countries. And NATO has expanded to I believe about 13 other countries since the end of the Cold War. Russia is wondering, why are you doing this? Why are you moving towards our borders? I thought the Cold War was over. We dismantled our Warsaw Pact and all of that stuff. Why are you guys expanding towards us? And so this is the whole historical context of this whole thing. And at this point, Russia has seen what's been going on for a very long time. And it's clear that NATO has designs on Russia and wants to surround Russia. And they have decided to finally, after all these years, take a stand within their own borders, on their own borders, to say, no, NATO, you cannot surround us. You cannot do this. We've tried our best to be friends with you, partners with you. And this is an unacceptable situation. Furthermore, there's been loads of trees that the U.S. has ripped up. During Trump, he ripped up the intermediate range missile treaty. Trump pulled out of that unilaterally. It's absolutely one-sided hostility in this, coming from the United States against Russia. And Russia's finally saying that this is unacceptable and they have to do something to create an agreement with the U.S. to put an end to this sort of extremely dangerous aggression on the part of NATO and the U.S. because this is very serious. Nuclear powers potentially, going head to head. There isn't, they're expanding to Russia's borders. There isn't much room for Russia to retreat from at this point. So Russia's trying to get the United States to negotiate to create some sort of a on paper infrastructure to stop this hostility.
Most definitely. I'm glad you mentioned that. And moving to you, Comrade BLevel, I wanted to ask you, because one of the things that I like that you cover in your channel and Ewoks Unhinged is that the left, the communist left, has to move away from thinking that it's still the 60s and the 70s. I think the predominant frame of thought in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, the synthetic new left that our friend Caleb talks about, is that the Republicans are the main danger and the Democrats are our friends that we have to win over. And in conversations I've had, I feel like sometimes I agree more, and people are probably going to try to cancel me or some shit.
I know where you're going with this, yeah.
But I find myself agreeing more with conservatives or libertarians who are anti-war, but are backward on social issues than liberals who are progressive on social issues, but are like pro-imperialists or like Rachel Maddow, soy latte, liberal types. And what do you think about that? Maybe you can comment about that, because I think that represents a big sort of cultural shift within the North American left that I think we're seeing those contradictions play out today.
Yeah, man, I would argue it's even a cultural shift in terms of North American politics overall. I think the right, there are many aspects of the right in terms of like conservatives, Republicans that are moving more towards a isolationist direction. A lot of Trump's America First was speaking to a very older, I think people call it paleo-conservative, like an older form of that, of isolationism versus playing global cop. I think a lot of people that were originally listening to the neocons and the George Bush era politics saw what that brought to the American people and to the world. And so you really saw a spike of anti-war libertarians in the mid to late 2000s that carried into the 2010s. I know, Ramiro, you were at, and Nick, I think you both were at Occupy, and Caleb's spoken a lot to this, that there were a lot of anti-war libertarians that you spoke to that were more in agreement with you on Gaddafi and on Libya with what was happening, where a lot of the neo-Trotskyist and latte liberals, they were like, Gaddafi's a fascist, tear him down, and it's that disconnect there. And I think this is one of the great challenges right now, like you spoke to in the left, that like we can have different, people might have different approaches on like social issues and whatnot, but when it comes to anti-imperialism, we might be united, and that's an important place that we can rally on. And also to people in the global south and people in the former Soviet Union, like I think they personally do not care what our domestic politics are a lot of the time, if it's just like we stay out of their stuff. So I think if we have an anti-imperialist front that is a broad tent thing, that is a good thing. You know what I mean? And of course, like we say, revolutionaries are going to be the most advanced of their class in terms of politics and social issues and whatnot. But having a broad tent anti-imperialist front, I think is very good. And I think popularizing anti-imperialism in a time of economic decline, the decline of the American empire, is something that should be absolute at the forefront of our priorities. And I think people applying cancel culture to anti-imperialism, unfortunately, are doing the job of the imperialists, because we want more and more people to be anti-imperialist, and we can work on other issues as we do more work together. But it's very important for us to be on the fundamental agreement that Western imperialism is a negative thing for the world, because Vash and people of his ilk, what they'll say is, oh, well, the West is more quote unquote progressive on certain social issues, so it's better for a country to be in the grasp of the West than to be independent and then have slightly more conservative social practice. And we saw that with Nicaragua, for example. Remember, we did talk about that, because I know you've addressed that quite a bit, and a lot of the Western left is not very good on defending Nica.
Yeah, no, most definitely. I think that's a great point. And if you go to anti-imperialist countries around the world, if you go to Nicaragua, if you go to Venezuela, to Cuba, to Iran, to Syria, sure, they might not be fully woke and know all of the correct terms and all the stuff that's in mainstream media that's promoted by MSNBC and the people in the mainstream. But when it comes to empire and imperialism, they will defend their country. They have a very different mentality from the synthetic left, and I love the term that Caleb coined, that is very based on victimhood, based on weakness, based on identity reductionism, based on how oppressed I am. But people in anti-imperialist countries like Nicaragua, like others, their understanding of anti-imperialism and socialism is based on family and revolutionary tradition and preserving culture, and not getting into debt, not getting into loans, not getting into usury, not getting into this nonsense life that Hollywood and movies and the liberal establishment promotes, simplicity and traditionalism. But and when you say that, some of the liberal quote unquote progressives get triggered, and they don't understand that. And that's why I tell people, like, travel, go to other countries, like meet people, because I guarantee you a anti-war libertarian on the right in the US will have more in common with an Iranian or a Venezuelan or a Cuban than they might even think, right? Because a lot of times, like, even within the right, obviously I'm not right wing, but even within the right, you have like this kind of Zionist liberal influence within the anti-war libertarians, that they try to say like, oh, China's our main enemy, right? Because on the right, a lot of times they kind of tend to focus more on China, and the liberals kind of tend to focus on Russia. And then the people on the right, they drum up they drum a war against China. But if they actually go to these countries and talk to people in Iran and other places, they'll see that they have so much more in common in terms of opposing usury, opposing imperialism, maintaining the traditions of the nation. And I think it's just really interesting. But I wanted to, turning to you, Comrade Flame of Liberation, this is a great comment and question. Shout out to my boy Chris Duran out in Jersey. He said, can you speak on the post-1991 Ukrainian government's consistent repression of working class and socialist formations and how that's led up to its current fascist condition? And also maybe talk about Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea as well.
Yeah. Well, just like the situation that I described in Russia, what happened in the 1990s with the horrible capitalist policies and the destructiveness of capitalism in the country, that was happening in all of the former Soviet republics and indeed all of the former socialist countries that were unfortunately toppled at that time period. And that was the situation in Ukraine. And as far as the the policies, it's very important to understand this current regime in Kiev, because the media, the politicians, there's this constant refrain about democracy. We have to defend democracy, the rise of authoritarianism, and you see the supposed progressives, quote unquote, like AOC, like Bernie Sanders, echoing this nonsense. And it sort of fits the tradition of social democrats and their support for imperialism. Although, to be honest, these social democrats here would be considered certainly to the right of social democrats elsewhere. But nonetheless, you see this going into their stuff. And it's a complete myth, because you could just look at the quickest thing is just look at Saudi Arabia. Totally authoritarian, heavily backed by the United States. Most of the dictatorships, or true or quote unquote dictatorships, most of the authoritarian regimes in the world are supported by the United States and the West. During the Cold War, the United States carried out numerous coups against democratically elected presidents throughout the world, under the guise of spreading democracy. So you destroy democracy and install dictatorship for the cause of democracy. It makes sense if you don't think too much about it.
I know, Nick, we did that podcast on Afghanistan about 6 months ago now, and we talked all about the Brzezinski strategy. And he was a Cold War liberal, yet was supporting the most far-right, pro-feudal, reactionary groups that would become the Taliban.
Right, exactly.
So it's really interesting. And we see that in Ukraine, too. These supposed progressive hipster liberals are supporting open neo-Nazis. And it's really funny because these same people, they'll talk about that cringy January 6th, like recount the vote rally or whatever that was, right? And stuff. And of course, there were some very reactionary people there, mind you. But it's like we're actually looking at a organized, regimented neo-Nazi Azov battalion, and they're just
and they're
like,
armed by the United States.
Russia's bad.
They're armed directly by the United States, and there were some Congress people that tried to put a stop to that, and they were demonized as Russian puppets and Putin apologists. But yeah, the United States has carried out numerous coups. Ukraine, perfect one, they overthrew democratically elected government, and so this whole mantra about spreading democracy, it's complete nonsense. And if we look at Ukraine specifically, this pro-NATO regime that was installed, they have censored so many opposition media. They've censored Russian language media. They have banned the Communist Party and other opposition parties. It is totally undemocratic. It's described rightfully so as a fascist junta. And they have within the Ukrainian National Armed Forces of Ukraine, they have a neo-Nazi battalion, the Azov battalion, that uses the Wolf's Angle symbol as their official symbol, which is a symbol heavily used by the Nazis and by the SS. And they often, as you could see, use actual Nazi flags and SS,
Also,
all kinds of Nazi symbolism and stuff. So
doesn't the NATO symbol look just like it? Like it looks just not perfect, but I should say it looks at home with the swastika and this other Nazi rule.
That's an
it just looks like it fits in.
Yeah, that's an interesting. Yeah, and a lot of the Nazis became one of the heads of NATO during the Cold War. At least one of the heads was a Nazi, German, high-ranking German general or officer. I forget the name, but you could look up, Nazis in NATO. You could see because NATO, if you think about it, NATO is it's a continuation of the Nazis. The Nazis, the Axis, in Europe. They were designed to try and overthrow the Russian Revolution, destroy the Soviet Union. And NATO continued that mission to try and overthrow the Russian Revolution and destroy socialism. And so it was natural that they would use these war criminal Nazis to help lead their organization. And so
you can see in Western Europe how they reinstalled tons of people related to the Nazi regimes. Whereas look at the GDR, the denazification that happened there. Like, you didn't see the same approach in the West because, Nick, as you spoke to, so many Western politicians, whether it was, Britain or Canada or what have you, they were like, hey, maybe these Nazis can go wreck the Bolsheviks. And that was their whole plan, was to have and I think they weren't expecting Hitler would go for it all, but they truly wanted the Nazis to wipe out the Soviets, which was always been the goal of utilizing fascists to put down revolutionary forces in the world.
Right. Yeah. And also a very important thing to point out is that now this is extremely important as far as U.S.-Russia relations. You think that this would be taught, Americans might know about this as far as hostilities between Russia and the U.S. And in the context of the Cold War history. The United States invaded Soviet Russia. The Soviet Union never invaded the United States. Now, people who hear this, they might say, what? That's crazy. What is this? You're making this up. Look up the Allied, quote-unquote, Allied intervention into the Russian Civil War, and you will see the United States, Britain, France, Japan, Czechoslovakia, and many, many other countries, imperialist countries, invaded Soviet Russia to try and overthrow the Bolshevik Revolution and put the Tsarists back in power. And they were all defeated by the Red Army, which says a lot. And so we have to think of this like the Axis Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, which killed 28 million people. The biggest war in human history, the most deaths in human history, some of the biggest battles in human history on the war between the Nazis and the Soviets. That was a continuation of world capitalism trying to destroy the Soviet Union. The world capitalist powers invaded following the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War. They all invaded Soviet Russia. And then the Axis, the Nazis, fascist Italy, and their small puppet satellite states like Romania, Hungary, all invaded the Soviet Union. It was a continuation of that. And then the U.S. picked up that mantle of anti-communism to try and continue that. So the world capitalist forces had invaded during the Russian Civil War and failed miserably. Then they regrouped, and some years later, in the 40s, 1941, tried to attack again, and they failed. And then NATO was another attempt. Now, in the nuclear age, of course, with atomic bombs, they were unable to do a direct military invasion, but the point of NATO was to try and surround the western portions of the Soviet Union and the Soviet allies and massively do military buildups to force the Soviets to siphon off their money for defense. And so that's all very important historical context, all this. That's never talked about. The fact is that one country invaded the other in history, and it was the United States. And that should be that should be known about. Americans should know about that, but unfortunately, we're not aware of that by and large.
What I want to do is, I'm glad you hit on those key points. I have one more clip that I want to play. It's been really a pleasure speaking with both of you, comrades. I have a clip from Garry Kasparov, who is a quote-unquote chess master and a political activist, quote-unquote, who speaks against Russia. He regularly calls for intervention against Russia. And it seems to be also one of the strategies that the imperialists use. Get these right-wing wealthy emigres who move to the US and Europe to cheer for war against their own nation. How disgusting is that? We see that with the Venezuelans in Miami, the Cubans in Miami, the Nicaraguans, the Syrians who support terrorism and Daesh. And this is one of the guys, Garry Kasparov, who's on the front lines of that. So I want to play this clip and get your reaction to how do we respond. to these people who say these things.
Gary, let's be honest. It sounds really tough and aggressive to say that the U.S. may sanction Vladimir Putin personally. But come on, how are we going to do that? I'm guessing at this point, he has well figured out how to hide his money. You do not become a multi-billionaire while you're in government from doing the right thing.
No, absolutely. But I don't think that's difficult. I believe that American intelligence knows more than enough about Putin's money, whether this money it's under his name, which I doubt very much, or in the wallets of the oligarchs spread around the world. By the way, your audience should recognize we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. The amount of money that was taken out of Russia during Putin's 20-plus year rule is estimated at around $2 trillion. So, and Putin definitely controls most of that. Again, not directly. So you don't have to sanction Putin personally, but you know exactly where to hit to make him feel sanctions. You talked about sanctions, but none of these sanctions hit Putin's interest. And Russian dictator, doesn't care about ordinary Russians. As long as Russian export of oil and gas keeps growing, and by the way, since invasion of Ukraine, annexation of Crimea 8 years ago, Germany doubled the amount of Russian gas it has been buying. So from Putin's perspective, sanctions is nothing more than lip service. And now it's the first time America is talking about real sanctions, but it's quite difficult because European allies, key European allies, Germany and France, especially Germany, that is filled with corrupt politicians doing Putin's bidding, they're standing on the way of that.
So what can we do, Gary?
First of all, America should reinstate its leadership. It's what people in Europe are expecting from America is to take a lead. And I'm talking about Europe.
Like?
It's now we see first time in 15 years since Putin spoke 15 years ago in Munich at the Security Conference about his plans to reinstate the spheres of influence in Europe. He talked about a NATO expansion as a threat to Russia. It was absolute nonsense. And he believes that Ukraine is not a real state and he has rights. The Russian dictator has rights to control former Soviet Union and even Eastern Europe. And so far, America hasn't responded decisively. And only now, we hear America talking about, just taking a lead and supporting other European nations like Baltic states, Poland, and other countries that, unlike Germany and France, recognize the threat from Russia. So hopefully now America is talking business. And if we see the real plan, not just a few hints, but the real plan on paper, what will happen if Russian troops cross demarcation line? I say demarcation line, not Ukrainian border, because Russia already invaded Ukraine 8 years ago. So the moment it happens, okay, America will respond. And some of these sanctions could really hurt Putin. When you talk about SWIFT, about Russian oil and gas export, and you should not worry about the rise of the gas prices in America. America has plenty of resources to boost its shale gas and oil production.
So you have this piece of shit, Gary Kasparov, saying America should reinstate its leadership, aka invade Russia and attack Russia. Your response, BLevel, to all of this nonsense?
This looks like a kids channel. Like, I'm watching this, and this feels like it straight up reminds me of like Canadian kids channel, like host stuff. Like, I'm just like, this is for adults. But yeah, I mean, this Gary Kasparov character, this is actually my first time hearing of him, and I feel like the grift to go around, and you're paid, by the way, to talk smack about your people and set up the red carpet for Western imperialists to show up, like paying lip service to that. In South Asian diaspora, we got people like that too. We got Dinesh D'Souza, obviously, but it's just, I see this, to live with that shame, it's like, and there's a good comment by Big Teal here about, she was talking about the fear that in Black History Month, these fascist imperialists will market the Cold War to Black and African people in the U.S. Here we go. And I think that's a fantastic comment. And I was thinking, likewise, for African people, for Asian people, I'm thinking about the South Asian diaspora as well. For all of us with, roots in the global South, what we need to do is look at our people's histories and look who had our back historically. And that was the Soviet Union, not the Western imperialists. So it's up to all of us to kind of, gain that sense of consciousness, to go back to our families, go back to our communities, spread the good words, spread the history. But, the Russian people have always been, very good to my people historically. yeah, during the the Cold War to the non-aligned people. Even they spread their benevolence. So I hope being part of this stream can pay a little bit of that forward. But no war with Russia, and hands off Russia to those imperialists. And honestly, if they get their hands in Russia, I don't think they're ready for the bear. The bear's just doing its thing right now. But don't provoke a proud.
Don't fuck
people.
with the Russian bear.
Straight
No, most
up.
definitely. And
Napoleon tried, Hitler tried, they all failed. They all came back cold and starved and wrecked.
They forgot their socks. That's why they lost. And the Russians kicked their ass. No, 100%. Well said, Comrade BLevel. I really appreciate that. And Comrade Flame of Liberation. I've known you for years. It's funny. I'm pretty sure you're in this video. So Comrade Flame of Liberation, for those of you who haven't know, it's an OG in the protest movement in New York. He's been going to communist, anti-imperialist rallies before it became as more popular as it is today. And in one of the videos, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're in this video. There's this Russian YouTuber who's like super anti-communist and super right-wing. I think his name is like Vlad or something. I forgot. But anyway, he's like, he would go to communist rallies. I think you were there, Comrade Flame of Liberation. There's other people.
Yeah.
And he goes up to them and he's like, I come from USSR. I live under communism. It is horrible. And then you guys were defending it. And I know you've had several interactions with people like that, being in New York, being in those. How do you handle those conversations where you have like right-wing, pro-imperialist people from that country cheering on for war? Like, what do you have any anecdotes related to that, or anything that you want to share related to that?
Yeah, well, first, I have to mention with Garry Kasparov, it's so weird. It's like, what's this guy's deal? It's like whenever anything happens, he has to come up with some angle that it's Russia's fault, even when it doesn't really have anything to do with Russia. But in cases like this where Russia's involved, he's the go-to guy to say how bad Russia is, to demonize, his own country. It's really, really sad. What a sad individual he is. And funny, people should find this interesting. Look it up. Jimmy Dore had a very interesting interaction with him a few years ago, I think maybe 2018 or so, where Kasparov was speaking on this supposed human rights forum, and Jimmy Dore asked very respectfully, politely asked a question like about U.S. supporting dictatorships and stuff, or wars justified and so on. Wouldn't wars kill people if you're trying to promote human rights? Isn't killing people kind of taking away their human rights? And Garry Kasparov lost it. He was so upset. He said, "Oh, you're a Putin's buddy. You're a Putin's buddy." And got so upset, he was furious at just a respectful question. And that's the thing, because he's such a liar, so dishonest. Any kind of disagreement, no matter how respectful or polite it is, he has no response to it. So he has to go crazy. So I think people would enjoy the interaction with him and Jimmy Dore from a few years ago. But as far as interactions, at first I was trying to think, what's this video you're referring to? But then when you told me about how who he was, he goes around and stuff and records people. I know exactly who you're talking about, and I remember that. And he also happens to be a very big Zionist as well. There's some videos with him making some terrible comments about Palestinians. Yeah, he's an interesting character. But
also to add, wouldn't he have been really young when the Soviet Union fell? He would have been my age, 25, and he's like, I want my rock and roll, I want my Coca-Cola and blue jeans, of that kind of mentality, versus people who really were much younger when the Soviet Union kicked off, and they got to really experience the benefits of socialism. So there's a bit
he does not reflect in any way the people of the former Soviet Union, and that's the thing. Interacting with him and interactions in general with people from the former Soviet Union. I've known many people from the former Soviet Union who live in the U.S., Russians, Armenians, Georgians, Ukrainians, others, and the vast majority of people that you'll meet from the former Soviet Union will tell you that life was better during the time of the Soviet Union. And if you ask them about the 90s especially, they'll tell you about the horrors of the 1990s. Most of these people left in the 90s. If capitalism was so great, why would they leave at the time period when capitalism is coming to supposedly rescue them? In fact, destroy their country. So it's very important to point that out, that even in the U.S., the vast majority of Russians and former Soviet people, they have a positive view of the USSR. Now, they may not be so quick to say that because there's sort of a stigma if you're like an immigrant to the U.S. and you say something that is sort of like against the U.S. government narrative. You know, there could be a stigma of saying that, you know, if you're an immigrant. So sometimes people might not be too open to that, to talking about this. But if you actually talk with them about it, they'll tell you the truth of the matter. And I think that's so telling because even the people that came to the U.S. Reflect, you know, the fact that the Soviet Union was very good and way better than what happened in the 90s.
All my friends of Slavic background in Canada, their parents came in that period that you discussed. And it's like, it really does prove that, again, yeah, if capitalism is so good, why did a bunch of people, this like exodus of immigrants with disaster capitalism? And there's one point that I should say. I mentioned the Ukrainian diaspora earlier, and specifically aristocratic people that were leaving the Soviet Union, coming to Canada, talking all the smack against USSR and the Ukrainian SSR. And I need to mention this because this is very important. It's important for the class character of diasporas that exist. You know, Ramiro, you've mentioned like the Gusanos and people like that, right? Yeah. And in the Ukrainians, a lot of the OG immigrants around 1900 were communist. Because the Communist Party in Canada greatly, just like for myself today, attracts like children of immigrants and immigrants. Because they get here, if not the parents, the kids, like, what the heck is this? The West? This is supposed to be good? And Communist parties greatly attract immigrants. So the Ukrainian diaspora was very left-wing, very proletariat. It was in the 1930s when these aristocrats came. And there was like prominent Ukrainian Canadian communists such as Joe Zukin, for example, in Winnipeg. There's actually a park named after him. So shout out there. I just wanted to give a shout out to the original people in diaspora who, unfortunately, their voices were overtaken by these far-right elites, these Ukrainian Gusanos, if you will.
I like that, Ukrainian Gusanos. And that reminds me as well, in Florida, interestingly enough, South Florida, what is today Miami, Fort Lauderdale, originally had a lot of Cuban communists when it was under Fulgencio Batista, who was a US-backed dictator. And Cuban communists were actually organizing at the time, the University of Miami. One of my fraternity brothers, Enrique Oltuski, he fought alongside Fidel and Che in the Cuban Revolution. He organized students during the 1950s to fundraise money for the Cuban Revolution. And then he moved to Cuba after the revolution. So it's interesting how, dialectically, you have this switch where, reactionary becomes progressive and progressive becomes reactionary. But it's been a real honor speaking with both of you, comrades. Do you have anything you want to say before we head out? Maybe starting with you, comrade BLevel?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a pleasure talking with you as always. For those in chat, thank you. This is a very important topic. Thank you for supporting Ramiro's stream here. And Unmasking Imperialism is a fantastic podcast. I love the new aesthetics, by the way. Shout out to the logo, whoever designed it. It looks very fresh. For those of you who haven't had enough of me and Nick, we'll be on at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific with Professor Danny Shaw. We'll be on my channel, Ewoks Unhinged. Check it out. We're going to be going into some of the history because there's so much here to talk about. It's been around the clock talking this anti-war, but it's important for us to be there internationally for all our comrades and all the people up in Russia, Eastern Europe, and anywhere that is being targeted by Western imperialism. So hands off Russia. All power to the Russian people. And yeah, hand off to Nick.
Beautifully said. What about you, Comrade Flame of Liberation?
Yeah, thank you for having us on. And, this is really important for people to see and, the context of what's going on now. And something I'd recommend for people to check out is a documentary from Oliver Stone called Ukraine on Fire. Came out in 2016, I believe. So there's a lot of stuff has happened since then that's missing from it, but at least gives a very good coverage of the history up until then. Not only the Euromaidan, NATO, U.S. Quote-unquote color revolution coup that took place in 2013-14, but the long history in Ukraine and goes into the history of neo-Nazis in Ukraine, the Nazi collaborators, anti-Soviet Nazi collaborators who worked with the Nazi occupiers, and those who carried out massacres of Jews and Russians and other ethnicities as well, Poles and others, anyone in that area, because the borders were very fluid at the time period, and prior there were a lot of different ethnicities besides Russians and Ukrainians. And by the way, Russians and Ukrainians are brothers Their history goes back such a long way, and it's so adds so much more heinousness to this situation. What the imperialists are trying to do to get these Russians and Ukrainians who are brothers to kill each other. It's really horrible. But this documentary goes into the long history of this, and I really recommend that. The Oliver Stone documentary on Ukraine. I believe it's called Ukraine on Fire. And I think, regardless of what's going to happen in Ukraine and Russia, the bottom line is that NATO expansionism, war, U.S. occupation of Ukraine, none of this is in our interests. Those of us in the U.S., Canada, and the West, this is not in our interests. They want to spend all this money on weapons, but, we supposedly can't afford health care, but we could afford all these weapons and occupations around the world. Homelessness, we can easily afford to get rid of homelessness, house everyone in this country. This is supposedly the quote unquote best country in the world. Well, how can we have this homelessness problem? We can afford to fix it, but that's not profitable for the ruling class. It's winter time now, and you got to remember back a year ago what happened in Texas with the extreme winter that took place last year, where the power failed and people froze to death. The official statistics, which is probably lower than the actual number, but nonetheless, they put it at 246 people who died last winter in Texas because of this failure of the capitalist infrastructure there. If this happened in any other country, the imperialists would be talking. If this happened in a socialist country, which it doesn't, the imperialists would be talking about, oh, socialism doesn't work. Well, we could see capitalism doesn't work for the people of this country. Furthermore, 68,000 people a year die due to lack of health care in this country. We could afford Medicare for all, but the ruling class does not want to. They want to spend their money on weapons of war to kill people, to kill the people of Donbass, to kill the people of Syria, the people of Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. They'd rather spend their money killing people than helping people in this country. And so we always have to point out that these wars, they're not in our interests. That them going over and killing these people, we are against that, not only because it's imperialism and it's war crimes and such, but it's also part of the reason why our living standards are so bad here in the West. So it's always, we have to emphasize that U.S. imperialism, stop its aggression against Russia. Russia is trying to set up a infrastructure, post-Cold War infrastructure that was not implemented on the Western side, to try and set up some form of official agreement so that this NATO expansionism could stop, because there was already an agreement between the Soviet government people and the U.S. and NATO. As the Soviet Union is being dismantled, the U.S. and NATO told the Soviets and the Russians that NATO would not expand past reunified Germany, and that did not happen. NATO has expanded, and now they're at Russia's doorstep. And so it's clear, all of the missile treaties that I mentioned that the U.S. pulled out of. On top of that, you can look at the Iran nuclear deal, where the U.S. makes this deal with Iran and then rips it up. It shows that U.S. imperialism can't be trusted. They make a treaty with a country, then they tear it up or they pull out of it. So this is a very dangerous situation, and we have to point out the truth of history and what's been going on, and push to stop this NATO expansionism and U.S. war around the world.
Thank you so much, Comrade Flame of Liberation. I really appreciate it. Thank you to everybody for watching and listening, to Brewski, to Jenny, to Big Teal, to everybody. Again, hands off Russia, no to NATO, no to Ukrainian fascism, solidarity with Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, and all anti-fascist resistance fighters in Eastern Ukraine and Russia, and money for jobs and education, not wars and occupation. Thank you so much, comrades. We're going to go out to some amazing revolutionary music from the Red Army era in defense of Russia, in defense of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and against NATO and imperialism. Peace out, everybody. Have a great weekend. Take care.
Доблестный флот, непобедимый, как наш народ. Ведь отойди до британских морей, Красная Армия всех сильней. Да будет красная непобедима на страже Родины родной. И все должны мы неудержимо идти на справедливый бой. На страже Родины родной. И все должны мы неудержимо идти на справедливый бой. Да будет красная непобедима на страже Родины родной. И все должны мы неудержимо идти на справедливый бой. Добрый